I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, the CDC is now urging Americans not to travel during Thanksgiving as cases of COVID-19 continue to surge. What does it all mean for the travel industry already struggling under the weight of a pandemic? Booking.com CEO Glenn Fogel will be my guest. Plus, Amazon making a big move to upend the pharmacy business. Will it work? One of the main incumbents, GOODRX, joins us to share their answer to the new competition. And the Bitcoin rally continues, but for how long? Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse will have his take later this hour. But first, tech shares leading the markets higher today as more COVID restrictions mean more staying at home for the foreseeable future. Scientists are racing to make advances on the vaccine front, but there is still a very long winter ahead. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, taking a look at the market movers of the day. Abigail, lots of conflicting strands here. How did it all add up?
You know, Emily, it's funny because yesterday we, of course, had the bearish news or the risk-off news, I would say, about public schools here in New York City closing, so restrictions on the biggest public school system here in the U.S. closing on the virus. We, of course, have hospitalizations at a record high in the U.S., and stocks yesterday sold off. Today, not so much. They rallied. Now, they started off in the red, and then they were basically flat on the day for most of the day, but at the end of the day, the NASDAQ 100 climbing by about 0.75%. So here we once again have that disconnect between stocks and a reality that would seem to be concerning, but the narrative around this is that stocks are looking forward 6 or 9 months when the vaccine starts to get into the system a bit more and hopefully helps really reverse this pandemic. However, stocks not taking into account the near term. Bonds are, so that's a story for another day. What helped the NASDAQ 100 today, lots of those stay-at-home stocks. So that's another conflicting piece of this tug of war, as John Farrow is calling it, although he's referring to something else actually too there. But Netflix, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook all higher. Those are the big mega cap names that have such a big weighting. This year's defense, well, defense was higher on the day, Emily. Those are the sectors that led, tech and discretionary.
Let's talk a little bit more about Amazon, as you say, edging higher. We've, of course, got this news of cases continuing, hospitalizations surging, more staying at home, which could be good for Amazon. How much of this, though, is an overhang from the big pharma news about Amazon making an even bigger play in prescription drugs?
So in terms of Amazon on the day, I think that at this point, we're really looking forward relative to that. I think it's widely acknowledged that it will be a big disruption to the pharmacy space, but it's not proven. So until that time, it's probably not going to do much for Amazon shares, and it really hasn't. Amazon is stuck in a range. In fact, you could make the case that the stock is technically bearish. Where we do have a reaction, though, are not surprisingly those drugstore stocks. CVS and Walgreens in particular over the last 5 days are down. But again, analysts are saying, yes, this is a big concern for the long term, but in the near term, it's unlikely to be all that much of an effect. But nonetheless, you can see big declines in this space, Emily.
Okay, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, thanks so much for breaking it down. More on that now. One of the companies that stands to see some kind of impact when Amazon enters the pharmacy fray is GoodRx. Just how big will that impact be? I want to bring in GoodRx co-founder and CEO Doug Hirsch. So, Doug, obviously there are some predictions. This will be incredibly disruptive to your industry. You are one of the incumbents. What is your answer to this?
Sure. What's interesting is Amazon has actually had mail order pharmacy for a number of years. They acquired PillPack back in 2018. And, the announcement of a few days ago was really just sort of updating the PillPack experience to try to get more people to switch to mail. The challenge is that mail is really hard. Only about 5% of prescriptions in this country are mail, and that hasn't even gone up even in the pandemic. And the reality is most people go to retail, and that's, of course, where GoodRx tends to play. We also work with Amazon to help them find discounts for pharmacy.
So does that mean you're not concerned? I mean, GoodRx has, 5 million members? Amazon has 90 million Prime members in the United States. I mean, how worried are you that some of those, some of your customers who also happen to be Prime members might move to the other side?
Sure. I mean, what GoodRx does is we help Americans find the lowest price for their prescriptions and for their healthcare anywhere. We've saved Americans over $25 billion. And, look, I applaud Amazon's efforts to get into mail. It's not what we do. We are a marketplace. We find the lowest prices and we send consumers there. What Amazon announced was really an upgrade to their mail order experience. As well, they also offered this discount card, which people seem to have misconstrued as somehow helping you get discounts at their competitive pharmacies like Walmart and CVS and Walgreens. I don't actually think that's a crucial part of this. In fact, I don't think Amazon or Walmart, for that matter, would be happy if consumers were leaving Amazon to go to Walmart. So really what we do is we provide this marketplace. We work with Amazon. We work with all the major pharmacies, work with drug manufacturers to find the lowest price. Just as a point of reference, the lowest prices with GoodRx Gold, our subscription service, are lower 90% of the time than what Amazon pharmacies prices are today.
So then how do you think this is actually going to change things for me, who has to go to the drugstore to get a prescription filled, and that is not really convenient, especially in a pandemic?
It's crazy because you think at this point, everything shows up at our house, right? I've got Amazon boxes showing up at my house every day. And yet pharmacy is so complicated. It's not as simple as just, one click. I mean, you have to get the prescription. There's all sorts of contractual reasons where your insurance company may or may not participate. Generally, they don't. Amazon, for example, is only doing 30-day fills. If you want a 90-day fill, you're going to have to go to typically your insurance company's website. The contracts and restrictions in pharmacy are so great, and I think they've been underestimated by many people. I'm old enough to remember like drugstore.com back in 2000, where they were going to revolutionize this whole thing, and the insurance company said, no, you're not. And so I think healthcare doesn't work like other industries where it's sort of a common sense industry. It can be very confusing and very restrictive. We're trying to unravel that. I think Amazon's trying to as well, but it could be a long time before mail is really a significant a part of the overall prescription economy.
Now, this is all happening as Congress is taking a look at Amazon over antitrust issues. Do you think that there are regulatory issues here that lawmakers should be concerned about, given that they're making a lateral move into an industry where, there's already concerns about how much power they already have?
I don't really have a lot of vantage point into, Amazon and regulation on that side. What I am focused on is overall government healthcare policy, which, I think continues to fail most Americans. Too many Americans are uninsured. Too many Americans are underinsured and just simply can't afford the healthcare they need. We work actually closely with government to provide information about pricing so that, political leaders can at least figure out how to solve this problem, because we've been around since 2010 before the ACA came about. Then everyone said the ACA was going to fix healthcare in this country. It hasn't really done that. Americans still need help, and that's where we're trying to fill in the gaps with Americans. And look, ultimately, we want to give Americans any choice they need so they can get affordable, convenient healthcare. And we're friends with anyone who will help us get there.
So where do you see then the innovation happening in the pharmacy business over, let's say, the next 5 years?
So we're really excited about certain categories. I think telehealth is amazing. I mean, if you haven't tried telehealth, it's been around for a long time, and yet very few people used it. And then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden it basically exploded. I think for certain categories, for example, mental health, telehealth is here to stay, right? If I can see my therapist in an interaction like you and I are having right now, that seems pretty good compared to other options. And it can also potentially bring down the cost of healthcare. I think there is room for a little bit for mail order. I think also we're finally seeing a lot of options where GoodRx has recently rolled out brand saving solutions, where we're helping people find savings on those massively expensive drugs, the drugs that are $500 to $500,000, where we're trying to actually drive people to solutions, also help doctors find solutions, because the high cost of drugs is really, people usually talking about those brand drugs, which have just cost too much. And we're really pleased at how manufacturers and pharmacies and everyone really is realizing they got to do something, because it's just not working and people are not taking their meds. And so we expect to see a lot of innovation around finding savings for brand prescriptions.
All right, Doug Hirsch, co-founder and CEO of GoodRx. Thank you so much, Doug, for joining us. Coming up, Airbnb has filed to go public on the NASDAQ, but could listing its shares on another trading venue still be a possibility? Our conversation with long-term stock exchange CEO Eric RIES is coming up next. This is Bloomberg. All right, we've got some breaking news to tell you about. The gaming company ROBLOX has just filed for an initial public offering. We're getting some nuggets from their filing. The company, which is very popular among tweens, I should say, reporting daily active users 31.1 million in the 9 months ending September 30th, joining the flurry of IPOs trying to round out 2020. Just this week, Airbnb also filed to go public on the NASDAQ, but the company might also list its shares in 2021 on an upstart trading venue for companies committed to environmental, social, and corporate governance values, they say. In addition to its traditional IPO, Airbnb is weighing a dual listing on the long-term stock exchange, founded by the lean startup author Eric Ries. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, this would be huge for the LTSE, and I know these conversations are confidential, but what can you tell us about the likelihood of Airbnb doing this with you?
I can't speak to which companies are going to list. All those conversations are confidential, so unfortunately, I can't say anything about that.
That said, if this were to happen with Airbnb or a company of similar size, what kind of legitimizing force would that have on, something that you've been working on for a long time and sort of been waiting for a company to make this move?
Well, I have been working on this for the better part of a decade, that's true. And, we're really excited that we were able to begin trading operations just on September 9th. So that is kind of the official start time for us to be able to have these conversations with companies. And, separate from any particular company, I think what's really important is the issues of corporate governance. In this next generation, there are really incredible corporate leaders like Brian, who you mentioned, who are really committed to a 21st century way of building companies that is different than what's come before. And our goal is simply to create a venue that is appropriate to their standards.
Now, you built a business on a best-selling book and a methodology, and I know you built a lot of strong relationships with founders, like people like Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky. Talk to us about your relationship with those kind of founders and how the kind of conversations you're having with them about making a decision like this.
It's a bit of a cliche now to think that people in Silicon Valley are trying to change the world, but as I've gotten to know people like Brian Chesky, I really think they are sincerely committed to it. I know he cares a lot about diversity, sustainability, what he calls multi-stakeholder way of building a company, his hosts, his guests, and understands that taking care of the human beings in his community ultimately leads to success for shareholders too. So if you look at the actions that these next generation leaders are taking, you don't just have to take their word for it. He launched a few weeks ago the Host Endowment Fund, placing a significant amount of the company's stock into almost like a sovereign wealth fund for Airbnb Nation, if you will. And I think this recognition that these platforms, not just Airbnb, but many of this next generation companies, these platforms are so powerful, they're like nation states unto themselves. And so the leaders of those platforms have a tremendous civic responsibility to shape what the 21st century is going to look like.
Now, we just learned that ROBLOX, the gaming company, has filed for an IPO to list on the New York Stock Exchange. Talk to us about the selling point of the long-term stock exchange. Why should an Airbnb CEO or ROBLOX or DoorDash or Affirm or any of these companies that are planning to get out of the gate later this year choose you? And what are they giving up if they don't go that traditional route?
Yeah, well, it's important to remember that we're asking companies to dual list so they can still have a primary listing on NASDAQ or NYSE. We would not set the open and close price, and we don't affect their access to liquidity. So none of the conventional things that companies seek to gain in an IPO would be lost by dual listing on LTSE. So the risk is actually quite low. One of the things that pretty much everyone in business agrees on is that short-term thinking has become an epidemic problem. And just look outside if you want to see the consequences of that. And so when you talk to managers at public companies, they increasingly are finding themselves living quarter to quarter. They struggle to make the right investments, to focus on the long term. Investments in innovation and R&D get starved. And that's not what this next generation of company leaders wants in their public markets experience. So, as we've seen throughout the pandemic, the companies that have this longer term focus, this philosophy, they're better equipped to deal with disruption. They're better taking care of their employees and customers, who you better believe are going to remember in the new normal who was there for them and who wasn't. So I think this capability to adapt while remaining true to their vision, that is the essence of this next generation of leadership. And the standards that we have embedded into the long-term stock exchange are aligned with that ethos.
Now, it's been an unprecedented year. We've got a lot of pent-up IPO demand over the next several weeks. We'll see how many of those companies actually make it out of the gate. What's your forecast for 2021? Do we go back to some kind of normal after this unprecedented time, or just does this kind of feeling of disruption continue for a while?
You know, it's funny to think that the 21st century is already 1/5 over, but anyone who thinks that it's going to be smoother or calmer in the years to come, I think is not paying attention. You know, we're basically 100 years removed from what our grandparents and great-grandparents went through. You know, remember the roaring 20s of the 20th century? I think when the pandemic ends, the activity that's going to be unleashed here is going to make the roaring 20s look quaint by comparison. But we have to learn the lessons, the civic lessons that they had to learn the hard way. You know, if everyone remembers what happened in the 20s, but then also the 30s and the 40s, we're headed on a similar trajectory if we don't make the civic investments now that you know, will allow us to build broadly shared prosperity throughout our society. So I do think that entrepreneurs and especially tech leaders have an important role to play in forging that new consensus, but it's going to require a kind of enlightened thinking about what is it? What is the role of a corporation? What is the purpose of a corporation in these turbulent times? And I think if we get that right, I think if we can really lay out the new ground rules, the new social contract of what it means to be a great company, we all have a role to play in that, you know, in the press and those of us who advise companies, and of course the founders themselves, in saying that these new companies, this new ethos has got to be about taking care of human beings and the societies they inhabit, or we're going to have a repeat of some of the atrocities we saw last century.
It's certainly an ambitious goal, but also certainly sounds very worthy. Eric Ries, long-term stock exchange founder and CEO. Eric, good to have you back here on the show. All right, coming up, we're going to be talking about crypto. Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse will be my guest next. This is Bloomberg. Bitcoin is having a moment in the sun again after a couple of seismic shakes that destroyed billions in value. The digital coin crossed $18,000 this week, the highest since January 2018, after a climb in late October when PayPal said it will now allow customers to transact cryptocurrencies. Joining us now to discuss what lies ahead for crypto's Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse. Brad, as always, great to have you back here on the show. Obviously, Bitcoin has been on a huge run, and we're seeing a new rally in cryptocurrency that we haven't seen in a few years. You know, what's your take on why this is happening and how long it will last?
Well, I think it'll last for a while. By the way, thank you for having me on. It's good to talk to you again. I think what we're seeing happen are some macro factors, not the least of which is, you know, when you print billions and trillions of dollars in stimulus of fiat currencies, many people take a look at inflation hedges. And while gold has historically been the darling in that category, I think increasingly you're seeing Bitcoin and digital assets broadly viewed as this is a real inflation hedge, and I think it's really driven a lot of the activity we've seen lately, and almost record highs.
Now, PayPal is now allowing users to buy, sell, and hold cryptocurrency, which is part of what kicked off this big run. But PayPal has decided to not include Ripple's XRP. What is your response to that?
Well, XRP has been a topic of lots of speculation in terms of how the U.S. regulatory environment would look at the currency XRP, which is separate from Ripple, the company. But a lot of foreign regulators across the world have looked at and been decisive about looking at XRP as a virtual currency. Here in the U.S., you haven't had that same clarity. And without that clarity, you have companies like PayPal and Square and others that they're supporting Bitcoin, and because it has that clarity. And look, I'm a bull on Bitcoin. I own Bitcoin, but I also think we need to acknowledge that when Bitcoin is more than 50% of the mining is in China, that China can control those technologies. And I think we in the U.S. really need to get in sync with other major economies across the world and how we look at an asset like XRP and treat it similarly.
So how concerned are you that China could, given their support of it, somehow, start to dominate that market and give the country an advantage?
Look, I think the Chinese Communist Party is being very strategic and is very focused on dominating this technology. I worry that this will be the next 5G race. We lost that race, and I think we're in danger of repeating that mistake again in the battle for what I think will be the future of our global financial infrastructure and payments. And, again, I think the irony is simply that unintentionally, as a regulatory body here in the United States, we have given an advantage to Bitcoin to provide what I'll call the good housekeeping seal of approval from the SEC that has allowed people to, like PayPal and like others, that with that clarity and that certainty, they are supporting those assets, and they're allowing people and entrepreneurs to build companies around them and to safely invest.
Now, you made headlines last month when you said Ripple might move its headquarters out of the U.S. due to the lack of regulatory clarity. Now that we have Joe Biden becoming president-elect, are you still contemplating that? What are your hopes under a Biden administration?
Well, I think a lot of these issues are very bipartisan, so I don't see it as fundamentally different between who is at 1600 Pennsylvania. I do think there are some subtle changes. Ultimately, Ripple is an American company. I'm a kid who grew up in Kansas, and we're a proud U.S. company. We want to stay here. We've generated a lot of tax revenue for the government and a lot of high-paying jobs. But we also need a level playing field. If we can't compete effectively with these technologies, in this case controlled by Chinese miners, then we have to be able to compete on a level playing field, and so we would look elsewhere. The one thing I will say that I think will change in a Biden administration is another drawback of how Bitcoin operates is mining, and 1% of global energy consumption is consumed by Bitcoin mining. And in a world where we should be attentive to carbon production and the impact of the dynamics going on in the climate, I think the Biden administration likely would be more attuned to those dynamics. And I think that will bring more attention to the lack of efficiency in Bitcoin mining.
All right, Brad Garlinghouse, CEO of Ripple. Always good to have you, Brad, on the show. Lots of things to watch. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Meantime, we've been getting some headlines out of the state of California. California has now ordered a 10 p.m. curfew for 94% of the state's population. This as cases of COVID-19 continue to surge, hospitalizations also surging. This is a pretty huge development, something we'll continue to follow, try to get some more details on that new curfew going into effect in California. Also coming up, vaccines for COVID-19 are looking promising, but does that mean travel will pick up once again? We're going to talk to the CEO of Booking.com, Glenn Fogel, next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. We're continuing to get more headlines about new restrictions being imposed in the state of California. My state, California, will be implementing a 10 p.m. curfew for 94% of the state's population for all counties that are in the purple tier. That includes my county, which is Alameda County. That does not include the county of San Francisco, which is currently in the red tier, but obviously very restrictive move. We're waiting for a live press conference from California officials starting at the top of the hour. This after we saw some positive news on the vaccine front this week out of Pfizer and Moderna. But the question remains, when can anybody expect life to go back to some sort of normal as we head into winter? The CDC is also now recommending that Americans not travel during Thanksgiving week. Joining us now, Booking.com CEO Glenn Fogel. Glenn, lots to digest here. What's your take as the guy who's running a travel business and has been, your business has clearly been disrupted over the last 8 months?
Hi, Emily, and thank you for having me. And it certainly has been disruptive, but what wonderful news coming out of Pfizer and Moderna. And hopefully we'll hear a lot more good news coming out of the other companies, the other pharmas, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca. Hopefully we'll have a whole bunch coming out. But the thing that I continue to remind our employees, as everybody's gotten very excited, I say, everyone remember, this is not like a light switch. It's not like we just turn on the lights and everything is now great. We have a long way to go between these announcements, and there hasn't even been governmental approval yet of these vaccines. And it's going to take an awful long time for the vaccines to be distributed and everybody to be taking these vaccinations, and then to be able to get to a level of safety that people feel that it's okay to do everything you used to do before this pandemic. So unfortunately, it's going to be some time.
So let's talk about what's happening in the short term. The CDC is recommending that folks not travel over the next week, Thanksgiving week. I just got off the phone with someone who's canceling a trip. Are you seeing bookings being canceled over the next several weeks? What's happening right now?
Well, we saw a significant downturn before the announcements that you just announced. We did our earnings call, and I talked about how the 7 days preceding the call that we just did, that all of a sudden our new bookings were dropping significantly, and our reported bookings were down 70% in the 7 days preceding our earnings announcement. And that's from a change. The summer wasn't bad at all. People were feeling pretty optimistic about things. But as the infection rates started going up, and not just in the US, it's even worse in Europe. We see those infection rates go up. We see bookings go down. We see cancellations go up. And that's what's been happening. And unfortunately, until people feel safe, we're not going to see a rebound.
So how will this holiday season compare to every other holiday season?
Well, it's going to be pretty horrible in terms of travel, and I think we all knew that. We talked back in April together, you and I, and we talked a little bit about how what we needed was a vaccine, and we needed also government stimulus. And now we've gotten, it looks like, hopefully, we've got some vaccines, though it has to be produced and then distributed. But we're also going to need governments to put some money to work to help prime the pump in travel. The travel industry has been so devastated. So many people have lost their jobs. We really need governments around the world to come up with plans and programs that as soon as it's safe to travel, to start putting money to work. And I'm thinking maybe tax credits to help stimulate demand, to get people traveling. Other countries are already doing that. In Japan, they're doing it, and we're working with them, and we're helping build domestic travel there. Thailand, same thing. And it'd be great if the people in the U.S. and the Congress and the administration right now and the President President-elect Biden, if they could all get together and come up with some plans, it'd be just really helpful so that when it's safe to travel, we get that demand up right away.
And we still don't know about additional stimulus. We do know that lawmakers are going home for Thanksgiving, but not whether or not there will be more stimulus. Do you think travel will ever get back to normal? If you think about all the kinds of travel, business travel, even after there's a vaccine, is your industry changed for good?
So a couple things about that. Look, there's always going to be travel when it's safe to travel. When everybody feels good about it, it's okay to get on a plane, we're going to get travel back. So I have absolutely no qualms about coming out and saying we will have more travel in the future than we did in the past, and we will go past 2019 numbers at some point in the future. But I think there are going to be some changes. And I think your point, mentioning business travel, I think business travel is going to be a bit different. I just don't see people saying that, okay, I'm going to get on a trip to visit a client, maybe, across the country or across the ocean for a one-day meeting at a very high expense and then come back and it's a whole day. I see people saying, I can do this by some sort of video communication, be just as effective doing that. And that really hurts the airlines that used to get those very, very high fares up front, those first class tickets, those business class tickets. That's a lot of money they used to get that I don't think they're going to get as much. And also the hotels, the 5-star hotels that were being filled with business travelers who were, let's face it, a lot of times it was the client who was paying the way. I think that's also going to be impacted. So what that's going to do is going to change the economics for some of the suppliers in the travel industry. Now, ourselves at Booking.com, we're much more leisure oriented. So for us, it's not going to be much of an effect. In fact, it could even help us because there'll be a lot more empty rooms at hotels. And also, I think the airlines will be taking out some of those flatbed seats and turning them into coach seats, and we'll have more seats there to fill. So I think as a distributor, this type of thing can be actually improving our business.
Now, in the medium term, are you seeing any evidence that customers are encouraged by the vaccine news? Like, are you seeing tickets pick up for, say, a year from now? Right now I'm thinking I can't do the spring break trip that we planned for this year and thought maybe we could do next year. I mean, is the news rippling down yet, or are travelers kind of paralyzed?
Yeah, I would love to have seen people say, okay, I figure it's going to be safe in the summer, and I see some really great prices, so I'm going to go grab that right now while it's still there. Haven't seen that yet. And it's interesting because some of the things we saw earlier in the year, when a country would all of a sudden drop the restrictions, for example, there was a time when the UK had some travel restrictions, and then as it got into the early summer, where the UK said, okay, it's okay to travel internationally. And we saw almost instantaneously when the restrictions dropped, the bookings went up. I have not seen any effect like that from the announcements of these vaccines, because I think people kind of are still thinking, well, we're not sure. When's it going to be safe? How long is it going to take? Am I going to be able to get a vaccine? And when will I be able to get it? So I think because there's so much uncertainty, people are still holding back.
Glenn Fogel, CEO of Booking.com, appreciate your transparency and giving us a view of the road ahead. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to recap those headlines that California Governor Gavin Newsom has imposed a curfew across the majority of the state of California, all counties in the purple tier, which includes my county, Alameda County, Los Angeles County, Sacramento County, to try and halt the continuing spread of COVID-19. This curfew will go into effect this weekend, 10 p.m. 10 p.m. is when it starts. All right, coming up, a $40 billion acquisition hangs in the balance with the potential to upend the chip industry as ARM Holdings awaits regulatory approval for its takeover by NVIDIA. I'll talk about it all with Simon Segars, CEO of ARM Holdings. This is Bloomberg. NVIDIA paring some losses after warning that data center chip sales would slow in the current quarter. The chip maker is waiting on approval for its acquisition of ARM Group, the chip division now under parent company SoftBank, for $40 billion. Known as the Switzerland of semis, ARM serves hundreds of companies while competing with none of them. But some fear the NVIDIA acquisition will threaten this. I want to welcome now Simon Segars, the CEO of ARM Holdings. Simon, great to have you back here on the show. I know you've said you've been on the phone with a lot of customers who are worried that the way you do business will change. How are those conversations going?
Yeah, hi Emily, thanks for having me on today. When we announced the deal 2 months ago, obviously there was a lot of people's reaction was, okay, well, what's changed and what is this going to mean for the future? So yeah, I've been spending my time since talking to lots of people, and a lot of those conversations have been with customers. And we've been explaining that ARM's business model is going to continue. We make our technology available to anyone who wants to license it, and that's driven an enormous amount of innovation over the last few years. And both ARM and NVIDIA have been emphatic in our statements that that mode of working is going to continue after the acquisition closes. We're going to create technology, and we're going to make it available to anybody who wants to build a chip using it.
So what actually will change under NVIDIA's ownership?
Well, we expect to be able to bring much more technology to market. We'll have a combined, much larger engineering capability. We'll be very focused on the future of computing, which is going to be much more data and AI driven than it has been in the past. We believe that together we can bring our combined strengths together, innovate faster, create more products, and make that broader portfolio of technology available to the world's chip makers, who are then going to innovate on top of them. So, we think that this is a way that we can go faster and bring more technology to market.
Walk us through the expected timeline for regulatory approval around the world and what you see as the biggest hurdle.
Well, we said when we announced the deal that we expected it to take about 18 months to go through the process. We still believe that that is the case, so we stand behind that. The process runs at different speeds in different jurisdictions around the world. There are different regulatory frameworks that you have to follow through. And we are, we're in the middle of it. Well, we're not really at the middle of it. We're at the start of it. We are talking to the different regulators, answering questions, pulling information together, preparing filings. As I said, it goes at different paces in different places in the world.
Now, chip technology has been at the center of U.S.-China tensions, and ARM's leadership situation there continues to drag on. How have the geopolitical forces impacted the business, your ability to do business, and how do you plan to rebuild those relationships?
Our business hasn't really been affected very much by what's been going on a geopolitical basis. Our technology is very popular amongst Chinese semiconductor companies. We're used extensively. We have strong and deep relationships there, and we're continuing to develop those. Obviously, we have to be completely consistent with export controls and the regulations that are applied to shipping technology. Export controls around the world. So, we maintain our compliance with those, monitor the changes very carefully. But our business in China is doing very well. We're seeing a lot of innovation there, and we expect to continue to partner with companies in China.
We saw Apple's announcement of the Mac line switching to their own chips. It's not great for Intel, but does this open the door for ARM in terms of really getting into PCs? It is something that has been promised for many years, but hasn't quite come to fruition.
I think across the board we're seeing great improvements in the performance and the energy efficiency of ARM-based chips. We've seen ARM-based chips deployed in PCs. I've been using a Windows 10 device myself, in fact, ever since we've been into lockdown. So, that is an area absolutely that we can deliver the performance for. With our benefits in energy efficiency, the ways in which our partners integrate other technology into the chips that they build, we think that in PC and in many other markets, there are some great system efficiencies that can be gained by taking that combined integrated approach.
ARM is just the latest in a series of big chip deals. Do you see more consolidation in the chip sector ahead, and what companies should we be watching?
I think there will be more consolidation to come. Developing leading-edge advanced technology chips is very expensive and becoming increasingly so. And so you really do have to have lots of chip designs to kind of amortize your investment costs across. And I think that naturally leads to consolidation in the sector. Even through lockdown now, we've seen a few deals announced. And I think we're going to see more to come as the smaller and mid-sized companies can either combine together or combine with larger companies, because it is going to become a business where economy of scale really, really matters.
All right. ARM CEO Simon Segars, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be watching to see how that acquisition progresses. Good to have you back with us. Okay, still ahead. With President-elect Joe Biden entering the White House in January, the FCC could see a change in its top executive. We're going to hear from FCC Chair Ajit Pai about what he's doing over the next few weeks ahead of Inauguration Day and what he wants the priorities of the next FCC to be. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Former President Bill Clinton said at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum this week that Chinese President Xi Jinping's long-term reign has upended U.S.-China relations and will require President-elect Joe Biden's incoming administration and its allies to take a much more coordinated approach to dealing with Beijing. I sat down with FCC Chair Ajit Pai earlier to talk about how he thinks a Biden administration will handle the years-long tension between the two superpowers.
The Chinese-United States relationship is a very complex one that goes well beyond the FCC's boundaries. But I think what you see now is a general recognition that the Chinese Communist Party has a very determined view about the way that it wants to order the world. It's not content to simply focus internally. Now we see them exporting some of their own values abroad. And yes, I've mentioned on Twitter quite frequently, for example, the fact that if they're willing to take action to cause censorship on things like basketball and flag emojis or games, what will it mean if they're from equipment based from Chinese manufacturers and subject to Chinese law is then incorporated into our communications networks? And you see a growing recognition. I think the FCC has spoken with a bipartisan voice. We see people on Capitol Hill speaking with a bipartisan voice as recently as this week. when they passed legislation saying that we need to think about open radio access networks solutions as a way of navigating around some of the problems that we've seen with Huawei and ZTE.
Do you think the stance on Huawei and ZTE will change under the next administration, under the next FCC? And if not, how do you see it changing?
All I can say is that thus far, the FCC has spoken with a unified bipartisan voice. And when you think about it, that makes sense. Whether it's a 5G network being built in New York City or in Navajo Nation, everybody wants that to be secure. That's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. When it comes to making sure that we provide the funding necessary for smaller carriers to be able to remove this equipment, there too, Congress has not seen a partisan affiliation. And so I think that the recognition of the Chinese Communist Party as a threat in this area, the recognition of the threat that Huawei and ZTE in particular can pose, and the recognition that we all need to work together, Congress and the executive branch and independent agencies, is something they think speaks very well about the unity on this issue.
At the same time, your FCC also ended the most direct FCC regulation of broadband networks, which some would say undermined their security. How does the FCC work to ensure that broadband networks remain secure under this new framework?
I would argue completely to the contrary. The decision we made to remove utility-style regulation has been a fantastic benefit to the American people. Since we made that decision back in 2017 to remove those net neutrality utility-style regulations, speeds in the United States have doubled with respect to fixed broadband. Millions more Americans have access to the internet. And over the last 8 months of the pandemic, what is notable is that even as millions of people are moving home and increasing the demand on the internet, the networks have been architected in such a way to sustain all of that traffic. In fact, fixed and mobile broadband speeds have increased during the pandemic. That would not have happened if we had utility-style regulation. The best evidence of that is Europe. Europe has that utility-style regulation that some net neutrality advocates love. And Thierry Breton, one of the European commissioners, had to go hand in hand to YouTube and Netflix and other streaming services at the beginning of the pandemic and ask them to proactively throttle content to video consumers from HD to SD, because they had not had the infrastructure investment that gave the European Union confidence that the networks would hold up. That's not something we've seen here in the United States. And I would argue that there's also a big benefit when it comes to security. Companies now have, because they have certainty in terms of building these networks, now they have the luxury of thinking, okay, now we need to think about security of those networks as well as the business case for building them in the first place.
Your decision on net neutrality spawned thousands of public comments, protests in the streets, that John Oliver segment where he was arguing in opposition to the decision that your FCC made. What is it like to make a decision that feels so unpopular?
You know, I think the key is to have the courage of your convictions. And I knew when we went down this path, there would be an outcry. I mean, no doubt about it. This has been a hot button issue since well before I got to the FCC. But at the end of the day, I think the wisdom on this issue was drawn from Gandalf, who in The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, as you might remember, says to Frodo, that is not for you to choose. All that is left for you to choose is what to do with the time that is given to you. I knew it was the right decision, and I knew that time would vindicate that decision. And sure enough, here we are 3 years later. And now when you go on Twitter or you go on other social media platforms and read about net neutrality, some of the people are wondering, whatever happened with that issue? I was promised the internet was going to die, yet here we are tweeting.
That said, it's likely that the next FCC will try to undo a lot of what you accomplished in your tenure. And bringing back net neutrality is top of the list. I'm curious how you reflect on that as you look back on the years and look ahead to Inauguration Day.
Well, we have done an incredible job, I think, on executing on the core parts of our agenda, closing the digital divide, advancing American leadership in 5G, making sure that we benefit consumers in terms of proactive enforcement on things like robocalls, and things like addressing markets that have for some people have fallen through the cracks. And for example, regulating the rates that inmates pay when they call people on the outside. And so those are the kinds of things that we've executed on. And I would argue that none of them know a necessarily party line affiliation.
With the Biden administration incoming, you're expected to follow longstanding tradition, which means stepping down before Inauguration Day, but you don't actually have to, and you could stay on as a commissioner. What are your plans?
Well, my plans right now are, as you might have seen from my blog post yesterday, just to make sure we have a successful December meeting. We have a lot of very meaty items teed up, and otherwise to do the bread and butter work of the FCC. We have a big C-band auction coming up on December 8th. This is going to be the largest 5G auction of mid-band spectrum ever in the United States. We've already gotten a lot of great bidders, and I think it's going to be very successful. So, yeah, I know there's a process for the election certification, the GSA ascertainment, all those processes are going to play out, but I'm going to focus on what's right in front of me, which is my job leading this great agency and the tremendous career staff that have allowed us to deliver so much productive value for the American consumer.
FCC Chair Ajit Pai will see what happens as Inauguration Day approaches. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Bloomberg Daybreak Asia coming up next. This is Bloomberg.